The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, and I knew it was going to ruin my entire week before I even opened it. I had been living in my lakefront property in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin for 6 months, enjoying the peace and quiet of my grandfather's old estate, when the Lakeview Meadows Homeowners Association decided I was their new favorite target. My name is Lucas Monroe, and I inherited this beautiful 10-acre property from my grandfather, Gerald Monroe, who passed away last year at the ripe old age of 92. The property sat on the northern shore of Geneva Lake, with a gorgeous stone house built in the 1920s and, more importantly, 300 feet of private lakefront. What I didn't realize when I moved in was that the neighboring subdivision, Lakeview Meadows, had been using my grandfather's private beach and dock for years under an informal agreement that apparently nobody bothered to write down or tell me about. I tore open the certified letter and read the contents twice, thinking I must have misunderstood something. According to the letter, signed by one Patricia Brennan, president of the Lakeview Meadows HOA, I was being fined $500 for allowing snow to accumulate on my property in a way that obstructed the view of the lake from the homes in their subdivision. I walked to my living room window and looked out at my property, then at the houses perched on the hill about 200 yards away. My property sat at lake level, while their subdivision was built on elevated land overlooking the lake. The letter claimed that my failure to remove snow from certain areas of my yard, specifically near some old evergreen trees along my property line, was creating an eyesore and blocking their pristine view. I called my lawyer, Martin Foster, who had handled my grandfather's estate. He laughed so hard when I read him the letter that I had to wait a full minute for him to compose himself. "Lucas, do you have any idea what you actually own?" Martin asked, still chuckling. "The house and 10 acres, right? That's what the estate document said." "Did you read the entire deed packet I sent you? The one that was about 40 pages long?" I felt my face get warm. "I skimmed it. I figured it was mostly legal jargon." "Right. Well, let me enlighten you. Your grandfather didn't just own the property the house sits on. He owned that entire section of lakefront. And more importantly, he owned the lake rights to everything within 500 feet of his shoreline. Back in the 1950s, he actually purchased the lake bed itself from the county during some complicated legal situation involving water rights and property taxes. Technically, you own a significant portion of Geneva Lake." I sat down hard on my couch. "I own the lake, a portion of it, yes. And here's the interesting part. About 15 years ago, the Lakeview Meadows development was being built, and they approached your grandfather about access rights. They wanted their residents to be able to use your beach and dock facilities. Your grandfather, being the kind man he was, agreed to let them have access. But he never signed anything permanent. It was a handshake deal, revocable at any time. So they've been using my property without any legal right to it for the last 15 years, yes. And now they're fining you for snow. Lucas, this is the most entertaining case I've had all year. Do you want me to respond to this letter?" I looked out at the snow-covered yard, at the beautiful pine trees that had been there longer than I'd been alive, and felt anger building in my chest. "No. I'll handle this myself first. But stand by, because I have a feeling this is going to get interesting." That Friday, I received a follow-up letter, this time delivered by hand. A woman in her mid-40s with a severe blonde bob and a puffy white coat marched up to my door and rang the bell repeatedly until I answered. "Are you Lucas Monroe?" she demanded. "I am. I'm Patricia Brennan, HOA president of Lakeview Meadows. Did you receive our letter regarding your fine?" "I did, and I'm not paying it." Her face turned an impressive shade of red. "Excuse me. The fine is clearly outlined in our community guidelines. Your property affects our property values. Your community guidelines don't apply to my property. I'm not part of your HOA. Your property borders our community, which means you have a responsibility to maintain certain aesthetic standards. The snow accumulation near those ugly trees is completely unacceptable. Several of our residents have complained that they can't see the lake properly from their living rooms." I leaned against my doorframe. "Let me get this straight. You want me to remove snow from my private property because it's blocking the view from your houses, which are on a completely different piece of land?" "That's correct. And if you don't comply, we'll be forced to escalate this matter. The fine increases by $500 every week you remain in violation." "Patricia, I'm not part of your HOA. You have no authority over my property." She pulled out a folder from her oversized purse. "Actually, according to our research, your property has been essentially part of our community for years. Your grandfather participated in community events, allowed our residents to use the beach, and generally cooperated with our vision for the area. We expect you to continue that tradition. My grandfather was kind enough to let you use his private beach. That doesn't give you jurisdiction over my property. We'll see what our lawyers say about that. In the meantime, the fine stands. You have until next Friday to pay and remedy the situation." She turned on her heel and marched back to her silver Mercedes SUV parked in my driveway. I called Martin back immediately. "They hand-delivered another letter. The HOA president just threatened me in person." "Did you record it?" "No, should I have? Start recording everything." "And Lucas, I think it's time we did some research into what exactly they've been doing on your property. Do you mind if I come up there this weekend? I want to walk the property line and see what we're dealing with." Martin drove up from Milwaukee on Saturday morning. He was in his 60s, tall and lean, with silver hair and the demeanor of someone who had seen every ridiculous legal situation imaginable and was rarely surprised anymore. We spent 3 hours walking my property, and what we found was infuriating. Not only had the Lakeview Meadows residents been using my beach, they had built a small changing station on my property, installed a kayak rack, and created a stone pathway from their subdivision down to my shoreline. The path cut directly through my property, worn down by 15 years of foot traffic. "They've essentially claimed adverse possession of this portion of your land," Martin said, photographing everything with his phone. "Except they can't, because adverse possession requires the use to be hostile. If your grandfather gave them permission, even informal permission, it wasn't hostile. So what do? First, we're going to send them a cease and desist letter. Then we're going to revoke their access to your property and the lake rights associated with it. And finally, we're going to send them a bill for 15 years of unpaid usage fees." "Can we actually do that?" Martin's smile was absolutely predatory. "Oh, we absolutely can. And given that they've decided to fine you for snow, I don't think we owe them any courtesy in how we proceed." The cease and desist letter went out by certified mail on Monday. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook. I let it go to voicemail. Patricia Brennan left 6 messages, each one more angry than the last. The final message was particularly entertaining. "Mr. Monroe, you cannot revoke our access to the beach. Our residents have been using that beach for years. It's practically public property at this point. If you don't rescind this ridiculous letter, we will take legal action. And you still owe us $500 for the snow violation." I called Martin. "She's threatening legal action. Let her. We have the deed, we have the property rights, and we have documentation of everything. In the meantime, I'd suggest you put up some no trespassing signs along that pathway they created. I did better than that. I hired a fencing company, and by Thursday, there was a very nice 6-foot privacy fence running along my entire property line. The fence cut off the pathway from Lakeview Meadows to the beach completely. I also had signs installed every 20 feet stating that this was private property and trespassing would be prosecuted. The reaction was immediate and explosive. On Friday morning, I woke up to someone banging on my door so hard I thought they might break it down. I looked through the window and saw Patricia Brennan along with 3 other people, 2 women and a man, all looking furious. I opened the door. "Can I help you? You put up a fence," Patricia shrieked. "Yes, on my property. That's generally allowed. You've blocked access to the beach." "To my beach, yes." One of the other women, a brunette in expensive yoga wear, stepped forward. "This is ridiculous. Our children play on that beach. We've had family gatherings there for years. On my private property without my permission." The man, who looked like he was dressed for a golf course despite the February cold, crossed his arms. "Gerald never had a problem with us using the beach. My grandfather was a kind man who let you take advantage of his generosity. I'm not my grandfather." Patricia's face was purple now. "We will sue you for this. You can't just block our access." "Actually, I can. This is my property, my lakefront and my lake. You have no legal right to any of it. Your lake, that's public water. Actually, it's not. I own the lake bed and water rights for 500 feet out from my shoreline. My lawyer would be happy to show you the deed if you'd like." The yoga woman looked like she was going to cry. "But we paid premium prices for our homes because of the lake access. The developer told us we'd have beach access." "Then you should talk to your developer about misrepresentation. That's not my problem." I started to close the door, but Patricia stuck her foot in the way. "You haven't paid your fine. It's now $1,000 since you failed to pay by last Friday and remedy the situation." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Patricia, remove your foot from my door. Not until you agree to pay the fine and remove this fence. I'm not part of your HOA. You have no authority to fine me. Remove your foot or I'm calling the police for trespassing." She finally stepped back, but her eyes were filled with rage. "This isn't over, Mr. Monroe, not by a long shot." They left, and I immediately called Martin to tell him what happened. He was delighted. "Perfect. They're building our case for us with every interaction. Now, here's what's going to happen next. They're going to send their lawyer after you. Be prepared for that. But we have all the documentation we need. Your grandfather's deed is ironclad." The lawyer's letter arrived the following Tuesday. It was from a firm in Lake Geneva, claiming that Lakeview Meadows had established prescriptive easement rights to the beach through their continuous use over the past 15 years. They demanded I remove the fence and restore access within 10 days or face legal action. Martin's response was swift and brutal. He sent them copies of the original deed, documentation of my grandfather's explicit verbal permission, which negated any prescriptive easement claim, and a counter-demand. We were billing Lakeview Meadows HOA $75,000 for 15 years of unauthorized use of private facilities, plus another $10,000 for the improvements they had made to my property without permission. We gave them 30 days to pay. That's when things got really crazy. The local newspaper, the Lake Geneva Regional News, ran a story about the dispute. Someone from the HOA had talked to them, painting me as a cruel outsider who was taking away a beloved community resource. The article was heavily slanted against me, making no mention of property rights or the fact that I owned the lake. I called the reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Mills, and told her the full story. She was skeptical at first, but when I sent her copies of the deed and the documentation Martin had compiled, her entire tone changed. The follow-up article that ran 3 days later was much more balanced, and it included the bombshell fact that I actually owned the portion of the lake the HOA residents had been using. The community reaction was mixed. Some people understood that property rights were property rights. Others thought I was being unnecessarily cruel. But the most interesting reaction came from other people around Geneva Lake who had been dealing with similar HOA issues. I started getting calls and emails from strangers thanking me for standing up to the Lakeview Meadows HOA, which apparently had a reputation for being overly aggressive and entitled. One email came from an elderly woman named Dorothy Marsh who lived on the southern shore of the lake. She told me that Patricia Brennan had tried to fine her for painting her dock the wrong color, claiming it affected the view from Lakeview Meadows properties, even though Dorothy's dock was half a mile away. The fine had been $250, and Dorothy had paid it because she didn't want the trouble. After reading about my situation, she was considering asking for her money back. This gave me an idea. I started documenting every interaction with the HOA, and I created a website detailing the entire situation. I posted the letters, the legal documents, photographs of the unauthorized improvements on my property, and a timeline of events. The website went viral locally, and soon people were sharing their own stories of HOA overreach from Lakeview Meadows. It turned out that Patricia Brennan and her board had been fining people for years over increasingly petty violations. One couple had been fined for having the wrong shade of white paint on their garage door. Another resident was fined for having a bird feeder that attracted too many birds. Someone else was fined for parking their truck in their own driveway because it was considered a commercial vehicle, even though the owner just liked driving a truck. The stories kept coming, and local news stations picked up the narrative. Suddenly, Lakeview Meadows HOA was under scrutiny, and Patricia Brennan was doing damage control. She gave an interview to a Milwaukee news station claiming that she was just trying to maintain property values and that I was being unreasonable about the beach access. I gave my own interview, calmly explaining the property rights situation and noting that if they had approached me respectfully instead of trying to fine me over snow, we might have worked something out. The interviewer asked if I would consider restoring beach access, and I said I'd consider it if they dropped all fines, paid fair compensation for past usage, and signed a formal agreement. The interviewer asked how much compensation I wanted, and when I said $75,000 for 15 years of use, her eyes went wide. The story kept growing. A lawyer who specialized in HOA law contacted me and asked if he could write an article about the case for a legal journal. A property rights advocacy group wanted to feature my story in their newsletter. And most surprisingly, the Wisconsin State Legislature's Housing Committee reached out, asking if I'd be willing to testify about HOA overreach at an upcoming hearing. But while all this was happening, the situation on the ground was getting worse. Residents from Lakeview Meadows were showing up at my fence line, taking pictures, and some were yelling insults. One man threw a rock at my house, cracking a window. I filed a police report, and the Walworth County Sheriff's Department started doing regular patrols past my property. Then in early March, about 3 weeks after I put up the fence, I caught someone trying to cut through it at 2 in the morning. My security cameras, which I had installed after the rock incident, caught everything. It was a teenage boy with bolt cutters. I called the police immediately. Deputy Tom Richardson arrived within 10 minutes. He reviewed the camera footage and recognized the kid. That's Bradley Brennan, Patricia's son. She sent her own kid to vandalize my fence. Let's not jump to conclusions, but we'll definitely be having a conversation with the Brennan family. The next morning, Patricia showed up at my door with Bradley in tow. The kid looked miserable and scared. Patricia looked like she'd been crying. "My son has something to say to you," she said stiffly. Bradley, who was about 16, mumbled, "I'm sorry I tried to cut your fence." "Did your mother tell you to do it?" "No," Patricia snapped. "I did not." He did this on his own because he and his friends are upset about not being able to use the beach. "Bradley, do you understand that what you did was illegal?" I asked the kid. He nodded miserably. "Yes, sir." I looked at Patricia. "I'm not pressing charges on one condition. You drop all the fines, you stop trespassing on my property, and you leave me alone. We can't just drop the fines. The HOA board has to vote on that. Then call a board meeting. Because if you don't drop this, I'm pressing charges against your son and I'm escalating my lawsuit against the HOA." "Your choice." She looked at me with pure hatred, but she nodded. "I'll call an emergency board meeting." The board meeting happened 2 days later and I was invited to attend. Martin came with me. The meeting was held in the Lakeview Meadows Community Center, a nice building with a view of the lake, my lake, and about 40 angry homeowners packed into the main room. Patricia called the meeting to order and explained the situation with barely concealed rage. The board consisted of 5 people, including Patricia. There was Douglas Herman, a retired banker who seemed reasonable; Susan Walsh, the yoga woman who had come to my door; Trevor Kingsley, the golf course-looking guy; and finally, Rebecca Martinez, a younger woman who hadn't said much but kept taking notes. "We're here to vote on dropping the fines against Mr. Monroe and potentially discussing a formal access agreement for the beach," Patricia said. Douglas raised his hand. "Before we vote, I'd like Mr. Monroe's attorney to explain the legal situation to everyone here." Martin stood up and spent 15 minutes clearly explaining the property rights, the deed, the lake ownership, and why the HOA had zero legal standing to fine me or claim any right to the beach. He was clear, professional, and devastating to their position. By the time he finished, half the room looked shocked and the other half looked angry. "So you're saying we never had legal access to that beach?" One homeowner called out. "That's correct. Mr. Monroe's grandfather allowed access as a courtesy, but it was never formalized in writing. But the developer told us we had lake access when we bought our homes," another person shouted. "Then you were defrauded by your developer, but that's not Mr. Monroe's responsibility," Martin replied. Patricia was gripping the podium so hard her knuckles were white. "This is ridiculous. Gerald was part of this community for years." "Gerald Monroe owned the property first," I said, standing up. "Your development was built later on his border. He was kind enough to let you use his property. You repaid that kindness by trying to fine me over snow and claiming authority over land you don't own." Susan Walsh stood up, tears in her eyes. "Our children have been playing on that beach since they were babies. You're taking away their childhood memories." "No, I'm protecting my property rights. And honestly, if you had approached me as a neighbor instead of sending me threatening letters and fines, we probably could have worked something out. But you chose to be bullies, and I don't reward bullies." The room erupted in shouting. Some people were yelling at me, others were yelling at the board, and a few were yelling at each other. Patricia banged a gavel trying to restore order, but it took several minutes. Finally, Rebecca Martinez spoke up. "I move that we drop all fines against Mr. Monroe, issue a formal apology, and negotiate in good faith for potential limited beach access with fair compensation." "Second," Douglas said immediately. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but the room was clearly turning against her. All in favor, Douglas, Rebecca, and Trevor voted yes. Susan voted no. Patricia abstained, which under their bylaws meant the motion passed. Fine, Patricia spat. The fines are dropped. Mr. Monroe, would you be willing to discuss access? I looked at Martin, who nodded slightly. I'd be willing to discuss a formal agreement, but it would need to include several conditions. 1. You'd pay fair market rate for beach and dock access, which we'd determine through appraisal. 2. You'd be responsible for all maintenance and insurance for the areas you use. 3. The agreement would be year to year, terminable by me for any violation of terms. 4. Limited number of people at any given time. And 5. You drop this ridiculous idea that you have any authority over my property. That's outrageous, Susan said. Do you know how much that would cost? Do you know how much it costs to maintain lakefront property? Or how much lake rights are worth? I'm offering you a privilege, not a right. Take it or leave it. Douglas stood up. I think that's fair. We should put together a committee to negotiate terms with Mr. Monroe and his attorney. The meeting eventually ended with an agreement to form a negotiating committee. As people filed out, several residents came up to me. Some apologized for the HOA's behavior. Others thanked me for standing up to Patricia. A few were still angry, but most seemed resigned to the situation. One older man, probably in his 70s, shook my hand. Good for you, son. That woman has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. Maybe this will knock her down a peg. Over the next few weeks, Martin and I negotiated with the committee, which consisted of Douglas, Rebecca, and a homeowner named Alan Price, who was a contracts lawyer in his day job. They were professional and reasonable, nothing like Patricia's initial approach. We eventually worked out an agreement. The HOA would pay me $15,000 per year for limited beach access for their residents. This was based on an appraisal of comparable lake access fees in the area. They would have access from Memorial Day through Labor Day, with a maximum of 20 people on the beach at any given time. They'd be responsible for all maintenance of the beach area and carry liability insurance naming me as additionally insured. The agreement was year to year, and I could terminate it with 60 days' notice for any violation. They also agreed to pay me $25,000 in back compensation for past use, significantly less than the $75,000 I'd initially demanded. But Martin advised me that getting something was better than fighting for years in court. The contract was signed in early April. Patricia Brennan was conspicuously absent from the signing, sending Susan Walsh in her place. I later learned from Douglas that there had been a special election for the HOA board, and Patricia had been removed as president. The residents had finally had enough of her aggressive tactics, and my situation had been the breaking point. Douglas was the new president, and he promised a more reasonable approach to HOA management, but the story didn't end there. In late April, I got a call from Deputy Richardson. Mr. Monroe, I thought you should know that we're investigating Patricia Brennan for embezzlement from the HOA. What? Yeah, the new board did an audit of the finances and found significant discrepancies. Looks like she'd been pocketing fine money for years. We're talking about over $100,000. You're kidding. Nope. And get this, some of those fines were completely fabricated. She was fining people for violations that didn't exist and keeping the money. Your case helped expose the whole thing because people started questioning whether their fines were legitimate. Is she going to be arrested? We're building the case now. Should have enough for charges within a few weeks. True to his word, Patricia Brennan was arrested in mid-May on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and theft. The local news covered the story extensively, and my role in exposing her schemes was mentioned prominently. Turns out that when people started refusing to pay fines after seeing my example, the new HOA board had commissioned a full forensic audit. Patricia had been running her own little scam for nearly a decade, inventing violations and pocketing the payments. The story became even more bizarre when investigators discovered that Patricia had been forging board meeting minutes to make it look like fines had been properly approved when in reality, she'd been acting unilaterally. Several residents who had paid thousands in fines over the years came forward, and the criminal case grew larger. I testified at a preliminary hearing in June, explaining how Patricia had tried to fine me for snow coverage and how her aggressive tactics had led me to investigate my property rights more carefully. The judge was clearly appalled by what he heard. Patricia's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive, but the evidence was overwhelming. The case eventually went to trial in September. Patricia was convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and individual homeowners she had scammed. Her husband filed for divorce before the sentencing hearing. Throughout this entire ordeal, my life had changed significantly. The property that I'd inherited as a quiet retreat had become the center of a major legal drama. But in a strange way, it brought me closer to the community. The reasonable people in Lakeview Meadows, who turned out to be the vast majority, became friendly neighbors once Patricia was out of the picture. Douglas Herman became a good friend. He was a skilled fisherman and taught me the best spots on Geneva Lake. Rebecca Martinez, who worked in marketing, helped me develop educational materials about property rights for the Wisconsin Property Rights Advocacy Group. And Alan Price, the contracts lawyer, actually became my attorney for local matters, allowing Martin to step back to his estate planning practice. The beach access agreement worked well. The HOA residents were respectful, kept the beach clean, and followed the rules. Their annual payment helped me maintain the property and make some improvements. I renovated the old boathouse and bought a beautiful vintage wooden speedboat that became the envy of the lake. In October, almost a year after I'd received that first ridiculous fine letter, I was sitting on my dock watching the sunset when Douglas walked down the newly installed boardwalk that connected the Lakeview Meadows properties to my beach under our agreement. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Not at all. He sat down beside me, both of us looking out at the orange and pink sky reflected on the calm water. "You know, I owe you an apology." "For what?" I knew Patricia was getting out of control, but I didn't push back hard enough. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that someone else would deal with it. When she started targeting you, I should have stood up to her immediately. "You stood up when it mattered," I said. "You were the first board member to vote for dropping the fines and negotiating fairly." "Still, I'm sorry you had to go through all that, and I'm grateful you didn't just shut us out completely. A lot of people would have. I'm not unreasonable. I just wanted respect and recognition of my rights. Once you guys gave me that, we could work together. The neighborhood's a lot better now, you know. We revised all the HOA rules, got rid of most of the ridiculous fines. We're actually focused on real issues like snow removal and maintaining common areas instead of nitpicking everyone's paint colors." "That's good to hear." "And the kids are thrilled to have beach access again. In fact, there's a group of parents who wanted me to ask if you'd be okay with us installing a small playground at the edge of the beach area. We'd pay for it and maintain it, of course." I thought about it for a moment. The old Lucas, the one who received that first fine letter, might have said no out of principle. But I'd learned over the past year that while standing up for your rights was important, being part of a community mattered too. "Sure, but I want approval over the design. Nothing too garish." Douglas grinned. Deal. Thank you, Lucas, for everything. You could have been vindictive after how Patricia treated you, but you weren't. You've been fair, and that means a lot to all of us. After he left, I stayed on the dock until the stars came out. I thought about my grandfather, who had loved this property and had been generous with it. He'd made the mistake of trusting people without protecting himself legally, but his heart had been in the right place. I'd protected what was mine, but I'd also found a way to honor his legacy of being a good neighbor. The lake was quiet except for the gentle lapping of waves against the dock posts. Somewhere in the distance, I heard laughter from one of the houses on the hill, the houses that had such a premium view of this beautiful water. My water, technically, but water that I was now willing to share on fair terms. My phone buzzed with an email. It was from Jennifer Mills, the reporter who had covered the story. She was writing a follow-up piece about how the community had transformed after Patricia's removal, and she wanted to interview me about the successful access agreement and what I'd learned from the experience. I replied that I'd be happy to talk to her, but I wanted the focus to be on the importance of property rights and respectful negotiation, not on the drama of the case. She agreed immediately. As winter approached again, I found myself actually looking forward to it. The beach access agreement ended after Labor Day, so I'd have the waterfront to myself again during the cold months. I'd stocked up on firewood, bought a new snowmobile, and was planning to do some ice fishing once the lake froze over. The fence I'd installed still stood along most of the property line, but we'd put in a nice gate where the boardwalk connected to my property. The gate had a coded lock that the HOA residents could use during the summer months. It was a physical reminder that this was my property, but I was choosing to share it. One snowy evening in December, almost exactly a year after Patricia had knocked on my door to yell at me about snow coverage, I was clearing my driveway when I noticed someone standing by the gate. It was Susan Walsh, bundled up in a heavy coat, holding a covered dish. I drove the snowblower over to where she stood. "Susan, hi. What brings you out in this weather?" She looked embarrassed. I wanted to apologize. I never properly apologized for how I acted when this whole thing started. I was so caught up in being upset about losing beach access that I didn't stop to think about whether it was even ours to lose. "It's okay. You were lied to by your developer. That's not your fault." "Maybe, but I was rude to you, and I voted against dropping the fines, which was wrong. So I wanted to bring you this." She held out the dish. "It's lasagna, homemade. It's the least I could do." I took the dish, warm even through the cover. "Thank you, Susan. That's very kind. And I wanted you to know that my kids, they absolutely love having beach access again. Last summer was magical for them. So thank you for giving us that opportunity, even though we didn't deserve it after how we treated you." After she left, I brought the lasagna inside and reheated it for dinner. It was delicious, easily the best lasagna I'd ever had. I sent Susan a text thanking her, and she responded with a smiley face and an offer to bring me her famous apple pie sometime. The property rights advocacy group invited me to speak at their annual conference in January. I talked about my experience, emphasizing the importance of knowing what you own and standing up for your rights, even when it's uncomfortable. The speech was well received, and several people came up afterward to share their own HOA horror stories. One couple from Kenosha told me their HOA had tried to fine them for having solar panels installed. Another man from Racine said his HOA had attempted to charge him a special assessment for neighborhood improvements that only benefited homes on the other side of the development. A woman from Madison shared a story about her HOA trying to ban her from parking her hybrid car in her driveway because one board member didn't believe in electric vehicles. The stories made me realize how lucky I was. I'd been able to fight back because I had clear property rights and the resources to hire a good lawyer. Many people facing HOA overreach didn't have those advantages. I started volunteering with the advocacy group, offering to consult on property rights issues, and even testifying at a few state legislative hearings about HOA reform. The Wisconsin state legislature eventually passed a new law in March, largely in response to cases like mine and Patricia's criminal conduct. The law required HOAs to maintain detailed financial records subject to annual audits, limited the types of fines HOAs could impose on non-member properties, and created a state ombudsman to investigate complaints of HOA abuse. The law was nicknamed the Brennan Act, which I found darkly amusing. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. I continued working remotely for my software company, enjoying the peace and quiet of lakefront living. The Lakeview Meadows community, under Douglas's leadership, became a model of reasonable HOA governance. They even won an award from the state homeowners association for their reformed policies and community engagement. When summer rolled around again, the beach access resumed without any issues. I'd occasionally join the residents for their community barbecues, and I taught swimming lessons to some of the kids whose parents wanted them to be water safe. The playground Douglas had asked about was installed in April, a tasteful wooden structure that fit perfectly with the natural surroundings. One warm evening in July, I was grilling burgers on my deck when I heard voices from the beach. A group of kids were playing volleyball while their parents watched from beach chairs. The scene was exactly what my grandfather probably envisioned when he first allowed the neighborhood to use the beach all those years ago, a community coming together to enjoy the natural beauty of the lake. Douglas saw me watching and waved me down. "Lucas, come join us. We've got plenty of food." I grabbed my burgers and walked down to the beach. Rebecca was there with her husband and kids. Alan had brought his grandchildren who were visiting from California. Susan handed me a beer and thanked me again for the playground, which her kids were currently climbing all over. "You know what the best part is," Rebecca said, gesturing at the peaceful scene. "This feels earned now. We're not taking advantage of someone's generosity anymore. We have a real agreement, we're paying fair value, and we're taking care of the space. It means more because we know what it took to get here." She was right. The beach access meant something different now. It wasn't an assumed privilege or an entitled claim. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement between neighbors who respected each other's rights. As the evening wore on and the sun began to set, someone started a campfire in the designated fire pit. The kids roasted marshmallows while the adults talked and laughed. Alan told stories about the old days on Geneva Lake before the big developments came in. Douglas shared his plans for the HOA's upcoming community improvement projects, all reasonable things like repaving roads and updating the common area landscaping. "Whatever happened to Patricia?" I asked, realizing I hadn't heard anything about her in months. "She's in prison in Taycheedah," Rebecca said. "I heard she's working in the library there, probably the first honest work she's done in years." "I almost feel bad for her," Susan said quietly. "Almost. But then I remember how many people she hurt with her schemes." "She made her choices," Douglas said firmly, "and she's paying the consequences. That's how it should be. What Lucas did standing up to her, it helped a lot of people get justice." I shook my head. "I was just protecting my property. I didn't set out to be some kind of crusader." "Maybe not," Alan said, "but you became one anyway. You showed people that HOAs aren't all powerful, that property rights matter, and that bullies can be stopped. That's worth something." As I drove my grandfather's old pickup truck back up to my house later that night, I reflected on everything that had happened. A year and a half ago, I'd been a guy who inherited a house and just wanted to live quietly. A ridiculous fine over snow coverage had changed everything, setting off a chain of events that exposed corruption, reformed a community, and taught me valuable lessons about standing up for what's right. The property still looked beautiful in the moonlight, the old stone house solid and permanent against the backdrop of ancient trees. My trees on my land, overlooking my portion of the lake. Property rights that I understood and protected now. But more importantly, I'd learned that protecting your rights didn't mean being isolated or cruel. It meant establishing clear boundaries and fair terms, then building relationships within those boundaries. The Lakeview Meadows residents weren't trespassers or enemies anymore. They were neighbors, paying customers, and increasingly friends. I parked the truck and walked into the house, the same house my grandfather had built almost a century ago. There was a photo of him on the mantel, standing on the dock with a huge smile, holding up a massive lake trout. He'd loved this place and these people, even if he'd been too trusting for his own good. "I figured it out, Grandpa," I said to the photo. "How to be generous without being a pushover. How to be part of the community without giving up what's mine. I think you'd approve." The house settled around me with the familiar creaks and groans of old construction. Outside, the lake whispered against the shoreline, eternal and peaceful. And somewhere up the hill, the lights of Lakeview Meadows twinkled in the darkness. A community transformed by the simple act of one person standing up for their rights. That ridiculous fine for snow coverage, meant to bully me into submission, had instead become the catalyst for positive change. Patricia Brennan probably thought she was teaching me a lesson about respecting the HOA's authority. Instead, she'd learned a much harder lesson about respecting property rights and the rule of law. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and walked out onto the deck, looking at the stars reflected in the dark water of Geneva Lake. My lake, legally and completely, though shared now under fair terms with people who appreciated the privilege. The next morning, I woke up to another certified letter in my mailbox. My heart skipped a beat, flashbacks to that first fine letter flooding through my mind. But when I opened it, I started laughing. It was from the Lakeview Meadows HOA, containing their annual payment for beach access and a thank you card signed by over 60 residents. The card read, "Thank you for sharing your beautiful lakefront with our community. We appreciate your fairness and your willingness to work with us despite our rough start. Here's to many more summers of kids playing on the beach, families making memories, and neighbors respecting neighbors. With gratitude, the residents of Lakeview Meadows." I hung the card on my refrigerator next to the photo of my grandfather and his lake trout. Two different approaches to the same situation, but ultimately the same result: that a thriving community using the lakefront responsibly and with gratitude. Later that day, I got a call from Martin. "Lucas, I have some news you'll find interesting. Remember those residents who were fined by Patricia for various ridiculous violations? Yeah, what about them? Several of them have filed a class action lawsuit against her for the fines they paid. They're arguing that since she was acting fraudulently and many of the violations were fabricated, they deserve full restitution beyond what the criminal court ordered. Will they win? Probably. Her assets are pretty much depleted, but they might be able to get garnishment of any future income she earns. More importantly, it sends a message about HOA accountability. Good. People should fight back against that kind of abuse. You inspired them, you know. Before your case, most people just paid the fines and moved on. You showed them it was worth fighting." After hanging up with Martin, I spent the rest of the day working on the boathouse renovation. I was converting part of it into a small museum about the history of the property and Geneva Lake. I'd found boxes of my grandfather's old photos and documents in the attic, including correspondence about the original lake bed purchase in the 1950s. One particularly interesting letter was from the Walworth County Board explaining why they were selling the lake bed rights. Apparently, there had been a tax dispute, and my grandfather had offered to buy the rights to resolve it. The letter praised his civic-mindedness and his commitment to preserving the lake's natural beauty. I made copies of the letter and other historical documents, planning to create a display that explained the unique property rights situation. It would be educational for the HOA residents and their kids, helping them understand the history and legal basis for the access agreement. As autumn approached again, bringing another anniversary of that first confrontation with Patricia, I received an invitation to speak at a national property rights conference in Chicago. My story had apparently spread beyond Wisconsin, becoming a case study in HOA reform and property rights enforcement. I accepted the invitation and spent several weeks preparing my presentation. I wanted to be clear about the lessons I'd learned, including the importance of knowing your property boundaries and rights, the value of having good legal counsel, the necessity of standing firm against bullying while remaining open to reasonable negotiation, and the possibility of building positive community relationships even after serious conflict. The conference was in November, and my speech was well attended. Afterward, I was approached by a publisher who wanted me to write a book about my experience. I politely declined. Living the story had been more than enough drama for me. I didn't need to relive it in exhaustive detail for a book project, but I did agree to write a shorter guide about understanding property rights for homeowners, particularly those dealing with HOA issues. The guide was published the following spring and became a surprising bestseller in the niche market of property law resources. All the proceeds went to the Wisconsin Property Rights Advocacy Group. Back at Geneva Lake, life continued peacefully. The second summer under the beach access agreement was even better than the first. The HOA had learned from minor issues in the first year and had implemented better systems for managing beach usage and maintenance. They'd hired a part-time beach coordinator who ensured the 20-person limit was respected and that the space was kept clean and orderly. They'd also created a reservation system for peak times on summer weekends, preventing overcrowding and ensuring everyone who wanted beach time could get it. I found myself spending more time with the community too. I helped coach a youth sailing program that some of the parents organized. I taught a class on lake ecology for the local elementary school. And I even joined the HOA's advisory committee for lakefront issues, providing input on matters related to the beach and water access. The relationship between my property and Lakeview Meadows had completely transformed. What started as a hostile confrontation over a ridiculous snow fine had evolved into a model of how property owners and communities could work together respectfully and successfully. Douglas stepped down as HOA president after 2 years, having successfully reformed the organization's policies and culture. Rebecca took over, and under her leadership, the HOA continued to prioritize reasonable governance and community engagement over petty enforcement and power games. Susan Walsh, who had been one of my harshest critics initially, became one of my closest friends. She and her husband invited me to dinner regularly, and I taught their kids to water ski during the summers. She told me once that my refusal to be bullied had inspired her to speak up more in other areas of her life, including demanding a promotion at work that she'd been too timid to ask for before. "You showed me that standing up for yourself isn't mean or selfish," she said. "It's necessary. And you can stand up for yourself while still being kind to others. That's the balance I was missing. 3 years after that first fine letter, I was sitting on my dock on a perfect summer evening when a car pulled up to my house. A young couple got out, looking nervous. They walked down to the dock and introduced themselves as Jason and Melissa Foster. "We're thinking about buying a house in Lakeview Meadows," Jason explained. "We heard about what happened with the previous HOA president and how things have changed. We wanted to talk to you about the beach access situation before we commit to buying." I spent an hour explaining the history, the current agreement, and how the relationship between my property and their potential community worked. I showed them the contract, the payment structure, and the rules for beach usage. I was honest about the rocky start but enthusiastic about the current positive situation. "So you actually own the lake?" Melissa asked, still wrapping her head around the concept. "A portion of it, yes. The lake bed and water rights for 500 feet from my shoreline. And you're willing to continue the access agreement, as long as the HOA continues to honor the terms and maintain good relations." "Absolutely. This arrangement works for everyone." They bought the house and became another addition to the community. Over the years, as older residents moved out and new families moved in, each one was educated about the beach access agreement and the history behind it. The story of Patricia Brennan's downfall became a cautionary tale told to new HOA board members about the dangers of overreach and corruption. I eventually made peace with my unexpected notoriety. I hadn't set out to become the face of HOA resistance, but if my experience helped others stand up for their rights and encouraged HOA reform, then something good had come from that frustrating confrontation over snow coverage. 5 years after the initial incident, I attended a Lakeview Meadows community celebration marking the anniversary of their reformed HOA policies. There was a ceremony where Douglas and Rebecca received awards for their leadership in transforming the organization. During the ceremony, Douglas called me up to the stage. "Monroe could have shut us out completely after how he was treated," Douglas said to the assembled crowd. "He had every legal right to do so. Instead, he worked with us to create an agreement that benefits everyone. He's been a true neighbor and friend, and this community is better because he chose cooperation over confrontation, while never compromising on his principles. Lucas, on behalf of everyone here, thank you." The crowd applauded, and I felt genuinely moved by the recognition. Not because I needed validation, but because it represented how far we'd all come from that angry confrontation on my doorstep years ago. As I looked out at the faces in the crowd, including people who had once yelled at me over the fence, people who had initially supported Patricia's aggressive tactics, and people who had since become genuine friends, I realized that standing up for what was right had been worth every difficult moment. My grandfather's property, my property now, continued to be a source of joy and community. The lake still sparkled in the summer sun, kids still played on the beach, and families still made memories on the shoreline. The only difference was that now, it all happened with mutual respect, clear agreements, and proper compensation. That ridiculous fine for snow covering their view of the lake had set everything in motion. Patricia Brennan had tried to bully someone she saw as an outsider, never imagining that the person she was targeting actually owned the lake she was trying to protect the view of. Her arrogance and overreach had been her downfall and had become a catalyst for positive change throughout the entire community. In the end, everyone got what they deserved. Patricia got prison time and public disgrace for her corruption. The HOA residents got to keep their beloved beach access under fair terms. And I got the satisfaction of protecting my property rights while building genuine relationships with good people who had been misled by bad leadership. The lake continued its eternal rhythm, freezing in winter, melting in spring, warming in summer, and cooling in fall. Houses changed hands, kids grew up, and new families joined the community. But the lessons learned from that conflict over snow and lake views remained constant: that property rights matter, that respect must be mutual, and that communities thrive when people work together fairly rather than trying to dominate each other. And every time I looked at that ridiculous initial fine letter, which I'd framed and hung in my office as a reminder, I had to smile. $500 for snow blocking the view. If Patricia had known then what I owned, what I could do, and how spectacularly her bullying would backfire, she never would have knocked on my door. But she did knock, and that made all the difference.